I never imagined my life would spiral into a moment like this. My name is Annabelle, and I'm 42 years old. To anyone looking from the outside, I have the perfect life. My husband Cyrus is a well-known entrepreneur who has built an empire with his relentless ambition. But that success comes with a cost. A family that feels more like an afterthought. Cyrus spends his days glued to his phone or locked in meetings, and his nights are reserved for his laptop and spreadsheets. He's rarely home, and when he is, he's distant, preoccupied, as if we're nothing more than the background noise of his life. I've learned to live with the loneliness, but lately it feels unbearable. We have a son, Zayden, who has just turned 20. He's Cyrus's son from a previous relationship, but I've raised him as my own since he was a little boy. Zayden has always been fiercely independent, a free spirit who hated being confined by rules or expectations. He dropped out of college 2 years ago, insisting he wanted to find his own way, and now works part-time at a small grocery store near our home. It was one of those unbearably hot summer afternoons, the kind where the heat seems to seep into every corner of the house, making the air thick and stifling. Cyrus had left early that morning, his departure marked by the hollow echo of the front door closing, leaving the house in oppressive silence. I was alone, as usual, trying to fill the void with busy work that did little to distract me from the growing sense of isolation. Around noon, the sound of footsteps on the gravel driveway broke the monotony. Zayden was home, his shift at the store done for the day. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside, sweat dripping from his forehead, his t-shirt clinging to his toned chest. "It's so damn hot today," Zayden said, dropping his bag on the kitchen counter and grabbing a bottle of cold water from the fridge. His voice was deep, carrying a casual charm that made him seem older than his years. I watched him from the living room, my gaze lingering a moment longer than it should have. He was growing into a man right before my eyes, a man who carried himself with a confidence that was both familiar and foreign. "Summer's always like this," I said, trying to mask the strange pang of warmth that rose in my chest. He gave me a smile, the kind that could disarm anyone, and sat down at the kitchen table. The house fell silent again. The only sounds the hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional drip of condensation from his water bottle. It was a silence that felt charged, heavy with something unspoken. Later that afternoon, I decided to take a shower to escape the sweltering heat. As I approached the bathroom, I heard the faint sound of running water. The door was slightly ajar, a narrow gap letting out a sliver of light. Without thinking, I took a step closer and froze. Through the crack, I could see Zayden standing under the shower, the water cascading over his broad shoulders, his bare skin glistening. My breath caught in my throat, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I should have looked away, but I couldn't move, rooted to the spot by a wave of emotions I couldn't name. I was his mother, or at least that's how I'd always seen myself. But in that moment, I felt something shift, something that terrified and confused me. A rush of heat surged through me, not from the summer air, but from something deeper, something forbidden. As I stepped back, desperate to escape before he noticed me, my foot hit the mop leaning against the wall, sending it clattering to the floor with a loud crash. Panic seized me, and without thinking, I turned and bolted down the hallway, my heart racing. I collapsed onto the couch in the living room, my chest heaving, my mind a whirlwind of shame and disbelief. The sound of water stopped, and moments later, Zayden emerged from the bathroom, a towel slung low around his hips, his damp curls framing his face. I avoided his gaze, my hands trembling as I tried to steady my breathing. "Mom, did you hear something earlier? Sounded like something fell," he said, his voice casual but tinged with curiosity. I forced a shaky smile, willing my voice to sound normal. "Oh, I knocked over the mop. It's nothing." He nodded, his expression unreadable, and disappeared into his room. But as the door clicked shut, I felt his eyes linger on me a moment too long. The air in the house was thick, with an unspoken tension that neither of us dared to acknowledge. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of Zayden in the shower resurfaced, haunting me with its intensity. I tried to push it away, berating myself for even allowing such thoughts to enter my mind. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had shifted irreversibly. The next morning, Cyrus left for another week-long business trip, his goodbye as perfunctory as always. "Don't worry, I'll call when I can," he said, planting a quick kiss on my cheek before disappearing out the door. Zayden and I were alone again, the house eerily quiet except for the sound of the clock ticking in the hallway. At breakfast, he seemed unusually pensive, his eyes darting to me as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, he broke the silence. Mom, I have a week off from work. How about we go somewhere, just the two of us?" he said, his voice hesitant but hopeful. His suggestion caught me off guard, but I quickly shook my head. "Your father wouldn't like that. He'd want to be here if we planned something." Zayden's face fell, but he didn't argue. Instead, he gave me a small, understanding smile, the kind that sent a pang of guilt through my chest. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, as Zayden cleared the dishes from the table and disappeared into his room. I sat there, staring at the empty coffee cup in front of me, trying to shake the strange tension that had settled in the house. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows on the floor, but it did little to ease the unease gnawing at me. By late afternoon, the summer heat was at its peak, and I found myself on the porch, sipping iced tea and staring out at the empty street. The sound of the screen door creaking open pulled me from my thoughts, and I turned to see Zayden stepping out, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something more hesitant. "Mind if I sit with you?" he asked, holding a glass of water. I nodded, offering him a small smile. Of course. He settled into the chair next to me, the space between us feeling smaller than it was. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the stillness broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the slight breeze. "Mom," he began, his voice unusually soft, "I wanted to talk to you about something." My stomach tightened, a mix of curiosity and dread washing over me. "What is it?" I asked, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. He hesitated, running a hand through his damp curls. "Yesterday, I saw you near the bathroom." The words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. My heart raced, my mind scrambling for a response, but no words came. "I knew you were there," he continued, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I just didn't say anything because I wasn't sure what to do." I felt my breath catch, a wave of heat rising to my cheeks. "Zayden, He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "It's okay, Mom. I'm not mad. I need to know if you felt something too." The question hit me like a freight train, shattering any pretense of composure I had left. My hands trembled as I placed the glass on the table, my mind racing with conflicting emotions. How could I even begin to answer that? How could I admit to myself, let alone to him, that something inside me had shifted in a way I couldn't explain? "Zayden," I said finally, my voice trembling, "this isn't something we should talk about." "But we have to," he insisted, leaning forward, his tone steady but desperate. "I can't stop thinking about it, Mom. About you." I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden porch as I backed away. "This isn't right," I whispered, shaking my head. "You're my son." "I'm not your son," he said, standing as well, his voice firm but not angry. "Not really. And you know that as much as I do." The words cut through me, leaving me breathless. He wasn't wrong. but hearing him say it out loud made it impossible to ignore. I turned away, staring out at the empty street, hoping the distance would quell the storm brewing inside me. But Zayden wasn't finished. He stepped closer, his voice softening. I know this is complicated, and I know it's not something we can just figure out overnight, but I can't pretend like nothing's changed. Can you? I closed my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. The truth was, I couldn't. No matter how much I wanted to deny it, something between us had shifted, and there was no going back. The boundaries we'd both clung to for years were no longer clear, and the thought terrified me. "Zayden," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "this can't happen. It's not right." He stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine, sending a jolt of electricity through me. "Maybe it's not about what's right," he said quietly. "Maybe it's about what feels real." The words lingered in the air, filling the space between us with a tension so thick it was almost suffocating. I turned to face him, my eyes meeting his, and in that moment, all the walls I'd built around myself began to crumble. Without thinking, I reached out, my fingers brushing against his cheek. The touch was tentative, hesitant, but it was enough to send a wave of warmth coursing through me. He leaned into my hand, his eyes closing briefly before meeting mine again. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's about us. What we could have if we just stopped being afraid." I wanted to argue, to push him away and retreat back into the safety of denial, but as I looked into his eyes, I realized I couldn't. The feelings I'd tried so hard to suppress were no longer just a whisper in the back of my mind. They were a roar, impossible to ignore. The porch fell silent, the world around us fading away as we stood there, caught in a moment that felt both impossible and inevitable. And then, without thinking, I closed the distance between us, my lips brushing against his in a kiss that shattered every boundary, every rule, and every fear I'd clung to. The kiss lingered in the air like a fragile secret, one that neither of us dared to break. As I pulled back, reality came crashing down, and with it a torrent of guilt and confusion. My breath hitched as I stepped away, my mind racing to process what had just happened. "Zayden, this can't happen," I whispered, my voice trembling. But he didn't let go of my hand. "Why not? Why are we pretending this isn't real?" His voice was steady, calm, but there was a raw vulnerability in his eyes that pierced through my defenses. "Because it's wrong," I replied, shaking my head. "You know it is. People, they wouldn't understand." "People don't live our lives," he said firmly, his grip tightening on my hand. "This isn't about them, it's about us." His words hung in the air, heavy with an undeniable truth. But even as part of me wanted to believe him, to surrender to the feelings I'd been fighting for so long, I knew the risk was too great. I took a deep breath, my voice firm despite the chaos inside me. "We can't, Zayden. It'll destroy everything. Your father, our family, us." For a moment, he was silent, his expression hardening as he let go of my hand. "So that's it then? We just pretend this never happened?" "Yes," I said, my voice cracking. "It's the only way." He looked at me for a long time, his eyes searching mine for something I couldn't give. Finally, he nodded, his shoulders slumping as he stepped back. "If that's what you want." The words cut deeper than I expected, and as he walked back into the house, the sound of the door closing behind him felt like the final nail in the coffin of whatever this was, or could have been. The days that followed were unbearable. Zayden and I avoided each other, the once familiar rhythm of our lives now fractured by the weight of what we'd shared. Cyrus returned from his business trip, oblivious to the tension that hung in the air, his focus on work as usual. But the distance between Zayden and me couldn't be ignored, and eventually it became clear that something had to change. One evening, after dinner, Zayden approached me as I stood in the kitchen washing dishes. "Mom," he began, his voice softer now. "I think I need to leave for a while, get some space, figure things out." I turned to face him, my heart sinking at the thought of him leaving. "Zayden, you don't have to—" "I do," he interrupted gently. "For both of us." I nodded, tears welling in my eyes as I placed a hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry, Zayden." He shook his head, a small sad smile tugging at his lips. "Don't be. Maybe this is what we need." The next morning, he packed his bags and left without much fanfare, his departure leaving a void in the house that was almost suffocating. Cyrus barely noticed, chalking it up to Zayden's free-spirited nature, but I felt the weight of his absence every day. Over time, life began to settle back into its familiar patterns, but the memories of that summer lingered, a bittersweet reminder of a line crossed and a bond broken. I threw myself into rebuilding my marriage with Cyrus, determined to salvage what we had, and slowly the ache in my chest began to fade. Zayden and I exchanged the occasional text, brief and cordial, but it was clear we were both trying to move on, and while I missed him more than I cared to admit, I knew his leaving had been the right choice for both of us. Looking back, I realized that sometimes the greatest acts of love are the hardest to endure. Letting go of Zayden wasn't just about protecting our family. It was about protecting him from a path that could only lead to pain. And though I still carried the weight of those moments with me, I found solace in the knowledge that we had both chosen to step back before it was too late. It was a choice born of love, not weakness, a choice that allowed us to heal and find our way forward, even if it meant doing so apart.